you. So this presentation is why can't perceived air quality, or why can or cannot perceived air quality indices tell you about indoor air quality. So this talk that was given at the workshop, in which we looked at the possibilities to develop the indoor air quality. This talk, I was not aware that there is a bracket in covering a letter C. So then I prepared the that looks at the positive and negative aspects of using the perceived air quality index in the context of indoor air quality index. Intention of this talk is not to whether cannot do it. It's to start the thinking process and give some reflections on what are the positive sides of using this and what are negative sides that need to be considered. Of course, our listener of this talk to make the decision it can be used or it cannot be used. So a little bit about the history of this, how this talk was created, and to proceed, I think we should go a little bit and talk on the reflection on the history of indoor sciences, because recently the paper was published in Indoor Journal by who made some reflections on the history of indoor science, where he made some points regarding of the perception of the air quality by humans in developing the science. And then, this is the quotation from the paper, which says that in the years of indoor science, odor was important, as well as actions between odor and irritation. The keynote in Berlin conference in '87, where proposed to explain the causes of sick building syndrome. Funge passed away. Actually, also a lot of research that has been done on the perceived air quality and the perception of air quality also has gone away. And there is other research today. I'm saying this is because we probably turned our back on this research, which some significant advantages, and maybe is and has been a very, very useful in understanding of the processes and some of the information that was added in the early years on what is important to study in indoor sciences. And also it has advanced our sciences to the certain stage. I want everyone listening to this that at the time in '87 we could barely have a sensor to measure carbon dioxide. Our sensor was extremely expensive, and not every laboratory could afford this. When we are 30 years later, nearly one can buy, even lay people can buy a CO2 sensor for money and monitor indoor environment. So at that time, using a different approach, an approach that can provide important information, was a very useful technique. And even if there are certain advantages for the method that can be still revisited and reconsidered. So start reductions and background. So quality is still used in many documents that relate to indoor air quality. Is an important determinant of indoor air quality. Every one of us, when entering a new space, take a sniff, and then we know whether there is is odor, and whether it doesn't odor, whether we like the air quality or we don't like the air quality, has been repeatedly used in research for many years, and measurements which deal with the air quality indoors. Quality is used or has been used to define ventilation rates that are prescribed by majority of ventilation standards. So, correct, you should know that the numbers that are in EN 15251 was 167,982 and ASHRAE 62.1 are basically calculated from determined from, not derived from the research used in the air quality of assessments of the air quality to levels of the quality of indoor air. Then perceived air quality has been extensively used to examine emissions from building materials at that ages of the indoor sciences, and even today technical measurements are very difficult or maybe very expensive, and not everyone can afford to do it. And of course, many of the metrics related with air quality related to perceived air quality, then use of the perceived air quality as a method to determine emissions from building materials was necessary. This approach is actually used in some of the schemes, labeling schemes for building and furniture materials. In Finnish M1 label, Danish indoor climate label, and German AGVB scheme, they use line approaches, but they still use the sensor perception. There is a describing sensory testing in connection with emission testing. It's a 16th and 30, which alters the method of determinations using sensory perception. It's extensively in many field studies as a quality of air in rooms, in the real buildings, not only in the laboratory. And certainly, it can be considered as an exposure metric because it provides some useful information on pollution and how we perceive it as humans. So this talk is to discuss three elements. The first question is whether perceived air quality is the reliable measure of air quality, the pluses and minuses of using the perceived air quality, and should we continue to use perceived air quality or completely abandon it? So that would be the most difficult question to answer, and I do not take this opportunity or the risk to suggest what we should do. We re-evaluate this again. Indoor air quality definitions. I think before we start talking about the perceived air quality, we need to talk about how we define indoor air quality. And there are several indoor air quality definitions that are available. A few of them, but most of them, I would say, they have similar elements in it. So the one I would recommend and I would focus on is the first one is in EPA and Wikipedia. It's actually Wikipedia is repeating EPA quality, which indoor air quality refers to the air quality within and around buildings and structures, only as it relates to health and comfort of building occupants. A very important definition because it says and around buildings. So outdoor air quality is important determinant of indoor air quality, and also it defines some outcomes to which relate the level of air quality. Outcomes are health and comfort of building occupants. Comfort of building occupants, the air quality can a very useful metric. Then WHO definition, and which also talks about the healthy life and people's well-being. OECD definition, which is more specific on saying that indoor air pollution refers to chemical, biological, and physical contamination. So health and comfort are voiced directly. Also, in glossary of indoor air quality that was prepared by International Society for Indoor Air Quality and Climate, ECAC. It has been forgotten glossary, but it contains a lot of terms related to indoor air quality, and not only this, but it says that it's an indicator of the types and amounts of pollutants that might cause discomfort and risk of adverse effects on human or else or damage to vegetation. So the discomfort is present there. So it's natural to perceive air quality in context, even in the context of those definitions. There are two important elements that we talked about when we talk about the definition of the air quality. The definition of indoor air quality includes the temperature and relative humidity. When we talk about air quality, I mean, lay people, they relate temperature and relative humidity, thermal conditions of the air with air quality, and exchangeably. Even the researchers, some of the scientists, or even professors at the universities, they would use this interchangeably. But note that neither of the definition defines temperature and relative humidity as determinants of the air quality. And then another issue is that we usually say, you know, the air is poor, air quality is poor, meaning that the air is warm or humid, for example, right? So there are really thermal attributes of the air to the quality. Go further. Perceived air quality is addressing only one class of pollutants, and these are the gray pollutants here. It's a gaseous pollutants, and basically most of volatile organic compounds, or even from time to time even semi-volatile organic compounds. Less and less other pollutants are addressed in the perceived air quality. PM, for example, is not addressed in the perceived air quality. So when it's perceived air quality, we have to be aware that the group of pollutants that would not be captured by that type of measurement, and we need to remember that when we talk about it. So, this is one. Now, the air quality. Definition of perceived air quality has several of those, and then here there are a few that I would like to mention. Is that the air is quality as rated by humans in the subjective evaluation by the Glossary of Indoor Air Science. And here we have to define two elements in it. One is the quality, and we define air, right? And it's the extent to which human requirements are met. It is defined by the human requirements of human expectations, or what we need from the indoor environment. About perceived air quality, the outcomes can be different. So we can talk about the ratings of odor, intensity, and we can talk about ratings of or assessments of freshness or stuffiness of air. But most often, when we talk about perceived air quality, or the air quality as it is perceived by humans, we refer to dissatisfaction, acceptability, dissatisfaction with the air quality, or acceptability of the air quality. It has been that the acceptability would cover the elements of the intensity, so the intensity, character of and character of the odor, of freshness, and the hedonic character of pleasantness. So that it contains all those attributes of the air quality. And one can find how what is the acceptable air quality is the air in which there are no known contaminants at high concentrations as determined by cognizant authorities, and with a substantial majority of the people, 80% exposed, do not express dissatisfaction. I'll back to this definition a little bit later and try to say a few words about why 80%. But again, the acceptable air quality is idea that there are no known contaminants, but with no details, but as when it's perceived by the cognizant, by a substantial majority of the people. So that no concentrations is to be from the cognizant authorities, and then we should have a majority of people that express dissatisfaction. To be on the perceived air quality, there are, we do not, I will come later, we do not have a sensor of perceived air quality. So when we measure perceived air quality, we use people. We can use two groups of people. We call them panels of subjects, and we can use an untrained subjects in a panel of untrained subjects. ASHA 62.1 defines as a group of untrained subjects who render a judgment of acceptability, meaning that there are people who are not particularly interested to perform this task and might be even familiar with the environment that they assess. In EN 15251 is that the panel is that when the objective scales. That it can be panel who enters, and also there could be people who spend some time indoors and then perform the quality. But they're impartial, and they are not as especially they are not particularly trained to do this. Actually, they should learn how to operate the scale on which they perform the equations. But other than that, there is no training. For years, used a different method. Used a trained subjects. In case of trained subjects, panel of trained subjects who perceived air quality in reference to the some reference exposure. So they are trained that the intensity and acceptability of the air would be referred to the reference scale, and then they perform assessment in accordance to this to this reference scale. Reference scale in the past was used, but there is also method they use butanol for that. Spend much time on this because this method is not used now. But to mention that literature from the early ages of the quality discipline, or maybe from 20 years ago, has reports actually measurements using trained subjects. Two panels are not directly comparable other assessments, and it's has been some work on comparing them. Advantages perceived air quality. The first important is an immediate exposure and response into one metric. So you don't have to think about to which are exposed. All the components of and then you do not have to know how to convert this those concentrations that you measure and those components, and predict how people would react when they to those components. Think about of the billions of different environments we have around the world, and then each of them can be different, and it would be to predict all the components with all the different combinations and mixtures. So, and then you would have to all those mixtures you would have to test against humans to find the responses to be predict in the future. So and all the new pollutants coming in, so that would be never-ending story basically. So this is an extremely important, probably one of the crucial advantage for this, that it actually provides you immediately what to do. I mean, is this error acceptable? If it's not acceptable, something has to be done to provide to improve air quality. By measure all the components, it would take basically more time before you will get to know it. One example of how to combine different exposure and response is this one, is when you compare the concentration of pollutants with their threshold, here odour threshold. So even if the relationship that is shown here is correct and can predict response, the problem with that relation is that there are certain analytical limitations on whether we can measure all pollutants, and also there are limitations regarding the threshold used for the odour, which are here in this equation. They can differ up to 3 or 6 orders of magnitude because of the way they are tested and so on and so on. So even in you, there are certain limitations, analytical limitations, and information limitations that it's very difficult to replace immediate response of a human or predicted using basically the measurement. The element is that they capture results of interaction and combine effects between different pollutants. So, I mean, I was mentioning that if we can measure all the pollutants, of course, but if there are certain interactions between pollutants and combine effects between different pollutants, and even transformation of some pollutants, it's even more difficult task to make the measurement. So perceived air quality will capture it very, very quickly. The example for this is the air cleaning device, which is using the photocatalytic oxidation principle, which are here. So in this technology, the process of converting the unwanted pollutants upstream the unit needs to create another unwanted pollutants downstream the unit. And we really don't know what type of, we know extent what type of unwanted pollutants are produced, but sometimes there could be some that we don't even know. And it is very difficult to do them with the analytical tree, and the perceived air quality will capture them very, very quickly because the air would not move when passing the air cleaner. It's actually would sometimes even aggravate. It is a sensitive method, at least as much as chemical analysis. It actually cannot be replaced by, here there's a spelling error, sensor array, not sensor array, electronic noise. A sensor in the beginning that can basically reproduce the perceived air quality. There have been attempts in the 90s to develop, and then maybe later in the 2000s there have been some work done on this. An example of the study of Wegner, who they used 7 different or 8 different responses from the sensors, and then the trained panel to perform the, and this is why you see the unit decipol. This is basically the unit that is used by the trained panel, who performs the ratings of the air quality. And here, between the actual vote and the predicted vote, I basically use the neural networks to be able to teach the sensors and try to predict the responses of the panels. But efforts actually have not produced reliable that can be used in practice. We don't have electronic nose at present that can replace human nose. And then this is what I was saying is perceived air quality is providing instant information about air quality as it is perceived by humans. It will done is we expose people to, you can see an example of the evaluations of emissions from building materials by people, and then we have a panel, so we can look at the group evaluation. We can also look at the each individual ratings and judge according to their preferences and their background, get to know why they basically assess like this in a different way. There are two last important elements of the advantages of using perceived air quality. First case, so I mean, it will tell us, is there a problem or there is no problem, and it's very intuitive and communicative. I mean, you have one bar and will tell you if you define perceived quality as a percentage of dissatisfied. It's very simple. I mean, this is how many people are dissatisfied with that quality. It is easy to understand by people from outside the indoor sciences and by practitioners, and the practitioners can further communicate this to their customers. So it's simple and intuitive, but it requires certain relationships that will allow formation of the ratings. Here you see the ratings that are given on left on the acceptability scales, and you need to transform those ratings into the percentage dissatisfied. So it requires a certain level of transformation of the data. We cannot use the direct data. Both acceptability assessments and ratings of odor intensity, or you can see on the right, the scale for odor intensity, can be actually converted into percentage of dissatisfied. Here we talk about malodors or the unpleasant odors. Of course, if you have a intensity of roses, probably you will see a different relationship. Here we are talking about odors that produce dissatisfaction here for the curve on the right. Advantages of using perceived air quality. It's actually, although it sounds very simple, intuitive, and I said, oh, we can use the panel. Panel enters, use the scale, and provide the and provide the thing. You can know the verification of that, and reliability and repeatability, which may depend on how you select, the people. Also, the question would be, what type of factors that you're using, what type of endpoints are you using, and those are different factors that can disturb precision of subjective ratings of air quality, and then it can be the endpoint, whether you assess intensity, acceptability, and if acceptability, there may be some personal, preferences to their assessments, and then so all of that can disturb the precision. The time measuring scale, as you saw, transformation curves that I showed you, and variation, and then sensitivity of subjects. I will go through some of those elements. Then let's start with the accuracy and size. So ask people whether they like or accept or not accept the air quality. So it's very, very simple. It's just basically you cross in the two rectangles, and but then you really need to have a very, very large panels to be able to increase your sensitivity, I would say, or accuracy. For type of scale is about 20% for 20 panelists, and this is why in standard 62.1, 20 panelists and 80% dissatisfaction. Because this is a precision. You want to have a precision and set the level down to 3% satisfaction, 99% acceptability. How many people that you need? So looking at the accuracy and results for the acceptability, continuous scale of acceptability. So the scale that you see, you need to have at least probably 30, 40 observers to perform the accurate measurements. Here, example, with a group of 40 panelists, 20% dissatisfied is estimated with a standard error of 0.8 on the -1 to +1. So a scale that is 2 units long, and standard is about 5 to 10%, and the 30% dissatisfied. So there is 15 to 30% dissatisfied if you use 40 panelists to gain 20% dissatisfied, and basically this is the range that is defined in EN 15251 between the different types of buildings, the quality of our in different types of buildings. So basically, you need to have large panels, and then if you think about using them in field and introducing them to a room, they can themselves produce a significant pollution. Moving on, another advantage of using perceived air quality is the mentioned earlier effect of temperature and humidity. Although quality of air quality, we do not see the temperature and relative humidity as such. It is very much affecting our perception, and it's because the thermal sense and the olfactory sense they're placed very, very close to each other, and even the bulb in our brain is actually processing them probably the same. So poor air quality is often associated with the humid air and hot air, and this is specifically well shown in the graph. Basically, this is from the studies of Fang, one of the curves, which clearly shows that by increasing relative humidity and increasing temperature, you see here the percentage of dissatisfied with the air quality is going up, which is getting worse. In this, we can say there's no example seen, but that could be up 15% change in the percentage dissatisfied with air quality in the range of temperature recommended in the category 2. So standard 15 to 151. So basically, only by modifying the temperature, you can create a negative response on the perceived air quality. So it's another issue. I mean, we all know that entering the room that is pretty smelly will be obnoxious in the upon, and then at some time we will be barely able to perceive us in the space, and that we don't know unless we leave the room and re-enter again, and that's known as the sensory fatigue. And the example from the work that I showed that this sensory fatigue occurs very, very quickly. It takes only maybe 4 to 6 inhalations to modify our perception. Here, this is acceptable on the Y scale, and the number of inhalations taken, and you see that 12 inhalations they change the perception from 70% to 30% dissatisfied. So it's a huge change, and it's a huge factor that affects that. It's also seen in this graph, which shows the perception of the effluence, a room that is occupied by people, by the visitors to the room, and you see reducing the concentration of the effluence by changing the ventilation rate will produce a measurable effect on the perceived quality of percentage dissatisfied, but not for those who are staying indoors and perform the evaluation. So the occupants will not be affected, and that's clearly because of the sensory fatigue. The rest of using perceived air quality, we are not able to detect pollutants that do not produce sensory response, and for all toxic pollutants. Carbon monoxide, we know about the carbon monoxide poisoning, and this is we need to have a carbon monoxide alarms, and radon, another toxic and the one compound that is causing cancer, and we are unable to detect that it is. also, the perceived air quality, I mentioned this earlier, is addressing only predominantly exposures to chemical compounds. And we see element of the entire world or the community of the pollutants that are present indoors, and especially those that have microbiological origin and do not produce odor, because, for example, mold is producing odor, specific odor, and then a particular matter modality not create protection against other modalities. So we have perception of air quality, comfort, and that may not be related to the maybe health outcomes. And some information that shows there may be some relation, but it's not very consistent. Two units were developed in this relation to the perception of air quality as alpha and decipol. I'll not go into details about this, but I also want to show how difficult it is to perceive air quality. What is the disadvantage of using it when you have different types of pollutants? So in the theory that has been proposed by Fang, he developed two units. It was suggested that you could basically represent any type of pollution indoors by the equivalent number of people. So, for example, and they call that OLF unit, and then that the OLF with the books could be corresponding to the same pollution as produced by 3 people. So here's that we can basically increase pollution load by the increased number of people of any other types of pollutants present in us. But then later studies showed that this is not the case, because each of the percent of different types of pollution sources or different type of pollutants is not the same, and the relationship that describes with exposure response relationship that describes response versus concentration, and this is presented here in the logarithmic chart. They are not identical. So the change in the concentration of the norm will not be the same, cause the same response as the change of the concentration of the sealant or varnish. You see, it will completely not follow the bioeffluence change in the bioeffluence. So this approach these results show that maybe the way how it can be done using the equivalent number of people added to the people that are present because of the other pollutants is not the right approach. But the quality has been used that it is related to performance of office work. So in this case, it has been actually very, very useful. Not unique. There are different combinations of pollutants can produce the same response on dissatisfaction. This is something that we really don't know. I mean, have the same response of the pollutants that may not produce different types of the responses of people. So there are the probably major disadvantages of using perceived air quality. So moving. So what cannot and what can perceived air quality tell us about indoor air quality? So can, in summary, can detect gaseous pollutants otherwise not identified by chemical analysis, and perceived air quality can tell us about preferences. Not provide information about pollutants not detectable by olfactory sense, may always provide protection against other negative effects resulting from exposures to air quality, and is disturbed by thermal conditions and adaptation, few other factors. So you can don'ts or can'ts are more than can, but it's the accident that I didn't produce the equal. That we have to remember that these are the elements that work against using perceived air quality as air quality index. So what next? I believe that the perceived air quality should not be considered as the universal IAQ metric, but can be considered for use in certain applications, mainly when conditions are well controlled and should not be completely abandoned. So on don'ts, it can be a universal metric and should be continued to use. In applications, I find very, very, very useful. Air quality can be an element of an IAQ metric. So an element. It cannot as the metric, but it can be an element of that. And should be directed towards improvement of quality and repeatability of measurements for that particular, because we don't have much. So I will stop here. Thank you very much for attention. And then if you are to learn more, if you have questions or maybe some comments, you can send to my email address that is specified underneath. Thank you very much.